Modern airliners can almost fly themselves. But when the automation fails, confuses, or turns against the crew, there are only seconds left.
Stalling. Stop! What's going on? Lord have mercy upon my soul. Lord have mercy, Captain! Pull out! God!
If you enjoy aviation stories, please like the video and subscribe to Terra Obscura. These are the 9 times the machine stayed in control longer than the humans did. The Boeing 737 MAX was supposed to be the safest version of the most popular airliner ever built. It looked almost identical to the previous generation. It flew the same routes. Airlines could put their existing 737 pilots in the cockpit with minimal additional training. That was the selling point. Boeing promised that the MAX would feel the same as the airplane it replaced. To make that promise true, Boeing had to hide something. The MAX used larger, more fuel-efficient engines than its predecessor, but the 737 sits low to the ground, a design dating back to the 1960s, and the new engines did not fit underneath the wings in the same position. Boeing mounted them further forward and higher up. This changed the way the airplane behaved at high angles of attack, the nose-up attitude that precedes a stall. The MAX had a tendency to pitch up more aggressively than older models in certain flight conditions. Boeing's solution was a software system called the Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System. When sensors detected a high angle of attack, this system would automatically push the nose down to prevent a stall. It was designed to work silently in the background. Pilots were not told about it. The system was not mentioned in the flight manual. It was not covered in training, and it relied on a single sensor to make its decisions. The airplane had 2 angle of attack sensors, one on each side of the nose, but the software only read data from one of them at a time. If that sensor was wrong, the system would act on bad information, and the pilots would have no idea why their airplane was trying to dive. On October 28, 2018, a brand new MAX, just 2 months old with about 800 hours on the airframe, flew from Bali to Jakarta as Lion Air Flight 43. During that flight, the angle of attack sensor on the left side, which had been recently replaced with a unit that was later found to be miscalibrated during an earlier repair, fed false data to the flight computers. The system activated. The nose pushed down. The stick shaker on the captain's side vibrated non-stop, warning of an imminent stall that was not actually happening. An off-duty pilot riding in the cockpit jump seat recognized the problem. He told the crew to cut power to the stabilizer trim motors, a standard checklist item for a runaway stabilizer. It worked. The system stopped fighting them. The airplane landed safely in Jakarta. That night, maintenance teams worked on the aircraft. The flight crew reported some of the malfunctions, but did not document the stick shaker activation. The airplane was cleared for service. The next morning, October 29th, Lion Air Flight 610 departed Jakarta at 6:20 local time, bound for Pangkal Pinang with 181 passengers and 8 crew. The same sensor, still miscalibrated, fed the same false data. The system activated again. The nose pushed down. The captain pulled back. The system pushed again. This time, there was no off-duty pilot in the jump seat to diagnose the problem. The crew started the airspeed disagree checklist, but never identified that the stabilizer was running away. The cockpit was flooded with alarms. The stick shaker was shaking. Air traffic control was calling with heading instructions. And every few seconds, the nose pitched down again as the system fired. For 12 minutes, the crew fought. They pulled the nose up more than 20 times. Each time, the system pushed it back down. The flight data recorder shows the trim wheel moving in opposite directions, the pilots pulling up, the software pushing down, over and over like a tug of war with a machine that never gets tired. At 6:33, 13 minutes after takeoff, the airplane struck the Java Sea at high speed. All 189 people on board were killed. The wreckage sank in shallow water off the coast of West Java. The flight data recorder was recovered quickly. The cockpit voice recorder took months to find. After the crash, Boeing issued a bulletin reminding pilots to follow the runaway stabilizer checklist. It was the first time most pilots and airlines had ever heard the name of the system that had just killed 189 people. Boeing had asked the FAA to remove all references to it from the flight manual in 2016, and the FAA had approved that request. The system was still flying on every 737 MAX in the world. The Boeing 737 has 2 radio altimeters, one on each side of the cockpit. Unlike barometric altimeters, which measure height above sea level, radio altimeters measure the airplane's exact height above the ground. They matter most in the final moments before landing. On the 737, the autothrottle gets its altitude data from the left radio altimeter only. If that altimeter fails, the autothrottle believes the false reading. On February 25, 2009, Turkish Airlines Flight 1951 departed Istanbul for Amsterdam with 128 passengers and 7 crew. 3 pilots were in the cockpit. The left seat was occupied by an instructor captain, one of the airline's most senior pilots. The flight was routine until the approach into Schiphol, as the airplane descended through 1,950 feet on its way to runway 18 right. The left radio altimeter suddenly jumped from reading 1,950 feet to -8 feet. According to the instrument, the airplane was already below the ground. This was obviously wrong. The right radio altimeter continued showing the correct altitude, but the autothrottle only listened to the left one. When the autothrottle saw -8 feet, it did what it was programmed to do at that altitude. It entered a mode called retard flare, which is designed to pull the engines back to idle just before the wheels touch the runway. The airplane was not near the runway. It was still nearly 2,000 feet in the air, but the autothrottle believed it was already landing, so it cut the power. The word retard appeared on the primary flight display. The engines went to idle. The autopilot, using data from the right radio altimeter, which was working correctly, continued following the glide slope and pitched the nose up to compensate for the falling airspeed. The airplane slowed further. The nose kept rising. None of the 3 pilots noticed the speed decaying. The first officer, focused on the approach, did not register the retard indication. At one point, the first officer manually advanced the throttles to maintain speed, but the autothrottle immediately pulled them back to idle because retard flare mode was still active. The first officer did not hold the throttles forward long enough to override the system. This was not the first time this had happened on this airplane. The flight data recorder showed that the same left radio altimeter fault had occurred on 2 of the previous 8 landings. Both times, the crew on duty recognized the problem, disconnected the autothrottle, and manually flew the approach. The problem was known. It was documented. It kept happening. On Flight 1951, the speed continued to drop. At around 460 feet, the stick shaker activated, warning the crew that the airplane was about to stall. By then, it was almost too late. The crew attempted to recover, but they did not execute the stall recovery procedure correctly. The nose was too high, the speed was too low. The engines, spooling up from idle, could not deliver enough thrust in time. The airplane stalled and fell into a muddy field 1.5 kilometers short of the runway, just before the A9 motorway. It broke into 3 pieces on impact. Remarkably, there was no fire. 9 people were killed, including all 3 pilots. 120 others survived, 86 with injuries. The Dutch Safety Board concluded that a faulty radio altimeter triggered the autothrottle to cut engine power, and the crew failed to recognize the speed loss in time. A 2020 investigation by the New York Times found that the Dutch report either excluded or played down criticisms of Boeing, following pressure from American officials, who emphasized pilot error over design flaws. The parallels with the 737 MAX crashes a decade later were striking. In both cases, a single sensor failure caused an automated system to act on bad data, and Boeing had not provided pilots with enough information to understand the danger. One faulty sensor, one automated system that trusted it without question. 3 pilots in the cockpit who did not catch what the machine was doing until the airplane could no longer fly. Just after 2 in the morning, somewhere over the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, the autopilot quit, not because it was broken, because it was designed to. The Airbus A330 was flying at 35,000 feet through thunderstorms in the Intertropical Convergence Zone, a belt of severe weather between Brazil and Africa, when ice crystals blocked all 3 of its pitot tubes, the small heated probes on the fuselage that measure airspeed. Without reliable speed data, the autopilot could not function. It disconnected itself and handed control to the pilots. This was not supposed to be a catastrophe. The blockage lasted less than a minute. The pitot tubes thawed on their own. In a dozen similar incidents on the same aircraft type, crews had managed without serious trouble. But on this night, with 228 people on board and the captain asleep in the crew rest area, the 2 co-pilots in the cockpit had less than 4 minutes to understand what was happening. They never did. The flight had departed Rio de Janeiro for Paris with Captain Marc Dubois, First Officer David Robert, and First Officer Pierre-Cédric Bonin. By standard long-haul procedure, the captain left the cockpit at 2:01 to rest, leaving Bonin in the right seat as pilot flying and Robert in the left seat monitoring. 8 minutes later, they entered the storm. When the autopilot disconnected, the airplane shifted from its normal flight control mode into a degraded mode that removed many of the automatic protections pilots rely on. In normal mode, the airplane will not allow itself to stall no matter what the pilot does with the controls. In the degraded mode, that protection disappears. The pilot can stall the airplane. Bonin did not appear to understand this change. Within 2 seconds of the disconnect, Bonin pulled back on his side stick, pitching the nose sharply upward. This was the wrong response. The correct reaction to losing the autopilot at cruise altitude is to do almost nothing. Hold the controls steady, maintain the current attitude, and diagnose the problem. Instead, the airplane climbed rapidly, lost speed, and triggered the stall warning. Bonin continued pulling back. Robert, in the left seat, did not immediately grasp what Bonin was doing. The Airbus sidestick system is designed so that each pilot has an independent controller, and unlike a traditional yoke, one pilot's inputs are not physically felt by the other. Robert could not feel that Bonin was holding full back pressure. He would have had to look at a small indicator to know. There is no evidence he checked. The airplane climbed from 35,000 to 38,000 feet in about a minute, bleeding speed the entire time. It entered a full aerodynamic stall. The nose was pitched up, the wings could no longer generate enough lift, and the airplane began falling. Neither pilot pushed the nose down, which is the only way to recover from a stall. The investigation later found that in every previous instance of unreliable airspeed on this aircraft type, not a single crew had correctly identified the problem and followed the proper procedure. The captain returned to the cockpit about a minute and a half into the emergency. He found 2 co-pilots in a state of total confusion. Robert briefly took control and tried to push the nose down, but Bonin, still holding his side stick back, overrode the input. Because of the dual input design, the system averaged their commands, and neither pilot gained full authority. Robert said, "Controls to the left," attempting a formal handover. Seconds later, Bonin took control back without a call-out. The airplane was falling at roughly 10,000 feet per minute, nose up, fully stalled. The Airbus struck the Atlantic Ocean belly first. All 228 people on board were killed. The wreckage sank to nearly 13,000 feet. It took 2 years and 4 search expeditions to find the black boxes on the ocean floor. Airbus and Air France had known about the pitot tube icing problem since 2008. A newer model that reduced the risk had been ordered. The first airplane in Air France's fleet was retrofitted on May 30th, 2009. Flight 447 departed 2 days later with the old pitot tubes still installed. In 2022, both Air France and Airbus were tried in France for involuntary manslaughter. Both were found not guilty. The court ruled that no certain link of causality between their decisions and the crash had been proved. The families, who had waited 13 years for accountability, left the courtroom with nothing. On the morning of March 10, 2019, Flight 302 departed Addis Ababa for Nairobi with 157 people on board. Another new MAX. The captain had over 8,000 flight hours. Immediately after liftoff, the left angle of attack sensor failed. Its reading jumped to 74.5 degrees. The right sensor read 15.3. The stick shaker activated on the captain's side and did not stop for the rest of the flight. The captain tried to engage the autopilot twice. It would not hold. The system activated. The nose pushed down for 9 seconds. The captain pulled back and used electric trim to counter it. The system fired again. The first officer called out the correct diagnosis: stab trim cutout. They flipped the 2 cutout switches, disconnecting all electrical trim, including the system. This was exactly the procedure Boeing had told them to follow. But here is where this crash diverged from Lion Air. The pilots had left the engines at takeoff thrust for the entire flight. The airplane was accelerating far beyond its normal speed. At 332 knots, the aerodynamic forces pressing against the horizontal stabilizer were enormous. When the captain tried to turn the manual trim wheel to move the stabilizer back to a safe position, it would not move. The force required was physically beyond what a human being could produce at that speed. The captain asked if the trim was working. The first officer tried. "It is not working." The captain told him to pitch up together. Both pilots pulled on the control column with everything they had. 80 pounds of force. Not enough. With manual trim impossible, the crew made a desperate decision. They turned the electric trim back on. The moment they did, the system reactivated. The nose went down hard. The flight data recorder shows the airplane diving at 33,000 feet per minute. 6 minutes after takeoff, it struck a field near the town of Bishoftu. All 157 people on board were killed. The final report concluded that repeated nose-down inputs from the system, triggered by a faulty sensor and an unrecoverable activation design, were the most probable cause. The NTSB agreed but criticized the report for not examining why the engines were never reduced from takeoff power, which made the trim wheel impossible to turn. 2 crashes, 5 months apart, same airplane, same system, same single sensor. 346 people dead. After Ethiopian 302, every country in the world grounded the 737 MAX. The FAA was the last major regulator to act. The grounding lasted 20 months, the longest in American aviation history. Boeing paid a criminal penalty of $243 million, $1.77 billion to airline customers, and $500 million to a fund for the families. The Department of Justice charged Boeing with conspiracy to defraud the FAA. The crew of Lion Air 610 did not know the system existed. The crew of Ethiopian 302 knew, followed the procedure, and still could not stop it. Nothing was wrong. No sensor failure, no hidden software, no mechanical fault. The Boeing 777 had flown 18 years without a single passenger fatality. 3 experienced pilots were in the cockpit on a clear Saturday morning, and yet the airplane flew into a seawall because the crew did not notice they were going too slow. Flight 214 arrived from Seoul after an uneventful Pacific crossing. In the left seat was Captain Lee Kang-kuk, nearly 10,000 flight hours, but only 33 on the 777. He was on a training flight, gaining his first operational experience on the type. In the right seat was an instructor captain with over 12,000 hours and 3,000 on type. San Francisco's runway 28 left had its precision glide slope guidance out of service for maintenance. The crew would have to fly a visual approach, judging their descent angle by looking out the window and reading a set of colored lights beside the runway. The pilot in the left seat later told investigators he was very concerned about landing without electronic guidance, but did not say so because other pilots were doing it, and he felt he could not refuse. On the approach, the airplane was too high. The pilot flying selected an autopilot mode to increase the descent rate, but because of the altitude set in the system, the autopilot did the opposite and tried to climb. The pilot disconnected the autopilot and pulled the thrust levers to idle. This silently switched the auto throttle into a mode called hold. In hold mode, the auto throttle stops controlling airspeed. It does nothing. It waits for a command that never comes. Nobody noticed. The word hold appeared on the instrument panel, but no audible alert sounded. The 777 had a low-speed protection feature that would normally prevent the airplane from getting dangerously slow by advancing the throttles automatically. But this protection did not function in hold mode. This exception was buried in Boeing's manual and was not widely understood. When the NTSB later asked 5 Asiana instructor captains when speed protection would not activate, one said he only learned the answer after the crash. The airplane decelerated steadily. The approach speed should have been 137 knots. At 500 feet, where Asiana's own procedures required the approach to be stabilized or abandoned, nobody called for a go-around. At 200 feet, the speed had dropped to 118 knots. The instructor finally noticed the airplane was well below the correct path. 8 seconds before impact, someone pushed the throttles forward. 3 seconds before impact, someone called for a go-around. Jet engines do not produce instant thrust. There was no time. The tail and main landing gear struck the seawall at the runway threshold. The tail sheared off. 4 flight attendants still strapped in their seats were thrown onto the runway. The fuselage slid 2,400 feet, spinning nearly 360 degrees before stopping and catching fire. Of 307 people on board, 3 were killed, all teenage passengers. 187 were injured, 49 seriously. The NTSB concluded that the crew over-relied on automated systems without fully understanding how they interacted. The acting chairman said that even in highly automated aircraft, the human must be the boss. But there is a deeper question. The pilot flying had nearly 10,000 hours in his logbook. How many had he actually flown by hand? At Asiana, standard procedure was to engage the autopilot at 250 feet after takeoff within the first minute. It stayed on for hours. It was disengaged maybe a minute or two before landing. A pilot could log thousands of hours and accumulate only minutes of real manual flying. The logbook said 10,000 hours. The hand said something very different. This is what the entire video has been building toward. We have spent decades making airplanes that can fly themselves. We have succeeded. But in doing so, we have created pilots who may not be able to fly without them. And when the automation fails, confuses, disconnects, or quietly steps aside, the humans in the seat are left holding controls they have barely touched, facing a situation they have never practiced. The better the computer flies, the worse the human gets at flying. And the worse the human gets, the more we need the computer. Until the one moment we do not have it. The Airbus A300 has 2 systems that control the airplane's pitch. The elevator, which is the movable surface on the tail that the pilot controls with the yoke, and the horizontal stabilizer, a much larger surface on the tail that moves independently to keep the airplane trimmed. The stabilizer is roughly 3 times more powerful than the elevator. In normal flight, both work together. But in one specific scenario, they can work against each other. and when they do, the stabilizer wins. On the evening of April 26, 1994, China Airlines Flight 140 was on approach to Nagoya Airport in Japan. The airplane, a 3-year-old A300, had flown uneventfully from Taipei with 271 people on board. The weather at Nagoya was clear, visibility 20 kilometers, a routine nighttime landing. Captain Wang Loqi had over 8,300 flight hours. First Officer Chuang Mengjung, the pilot flying, had 1,624. He had trained on the A300 at a simulator facility in Bangkok run by a third-party contractor. That detail would matter. On final approach, descending through 1,000 feet with landing gear down and flaps set, the first officer's hand brushed the go-around levers on the throttle. The go-around mode activated. This was not an emergency. Go-around mode is a standard function that increases engine thrust and commands a pitch-up attitude, used when a crew decides to abort a landing and climb away. The problem was that no one intended to go around. It was an accidental press. The first officer noticed the thrust increasing and tried to correct. He pushed the yoke forward to bring the nose back down and manually reduced the throttle. The captain saw the mode change on his display and warned the first officer twice that go-around was engaged. He told him to disengage it. The first officer tried to cancel the mode, but could not re-engage the normal landing mode. He did not tell the captain he was struggling. Then they made the critical mistake. Someone re-engaged the autopilot while go-around mode was still active. From this moment, the autopilot began doing exactly what go-around mode told it to do: climb. It started driving the horizontal stabilizer toward its full nose-up position. At the same time, the first officer was pushing the yoke forward, commanding the elevator to pitch the nose down. The two systems were now fighting each other. The pilot was pushing down. The autopilot was trimming up. The stabilizer was 3 times more powerful than the elevator. The pilot was losing. The first officer felt the yoke resisting him. It was getting heavier with every second as the stabilizer moved further nose up. But he did not disconnect the autopilot. The captain had previously flown the Boeing 747, where pushing the yoke hard enough will automatically override the autopilot. On the A300, this does not happen. The autopilot keeps working regardless of how hard the pilot pushes. Airbus had developed a software update that would disconnect the autopilot if the pilot applied enough force during go-around mode. China Airlines had not installed it. The captain's simulator in Bangkok had not replicated this behavior either. Neither pilot understood that they were in a tug-of-war they could not win without pressing the disconnect button. Within seconds, the stabilizer reached its full nose-up limit. The airplane pitched up steeply. Airspeed dropped. The aircraft entered an aerodynamic stall at about 500 feet above the ground. The captain, now on the controls, attempted a go-around, pulling back on the yoke and adding to the already extreme nose-up attitude. There was no altitude to recover. At 20:15 local time, the plane stalled completely and struck the ground beside the runway. Of the 271 people on board, 264 were killed. 7 survived, all seated between rows 7 and 15 in the forward section of the cabin. The investigation by Japan's Aircraft Accident Investigation Commission found that the primary cause was the crew's failure to disconnect the autopilot. But the deeper problem was design. In previous years, there had been multiple similar incidents on the A300 and the A310, where pilots and autopilots fought each other during go-around mode, nearly creating the same catastrophic trim condition. Airbus had sent operators a summary of these incidents, but investigators found it did not contain enough technical detail for airlines to understand the danger. The airplane was working exactly as it was programmed to work. The pilot was doing what he was trained to do. The problem was that the machine and the man had different ideas about what should happen, and nobody had made sure they spoke the same language.
Starling. Stop. What's going on? Lord have mercy upon my soul. Lord have mercy, Captain! Pull out! God!
Conrad Jules Aska wanted to fly for a major airline. Over his career, he moved through 6 carriers, starting at a small Caribbean regional airline and working his way up. At 2 airlines, he failed training. Instructors at others noted a pattern. In unexpected simulator situations, he reacted impulsively and poorly under pressure. When he applied to Atlas Air, which operated Boeing 767s for Amazon and the U.S. Postal Service, he left the failed airlines off his resume. Atlas hired him. During his training at the company, the pattern continued. He was declined for his type rating oral exam and required remedial training. His simulator partner complained about being held back by him. Atlas had to restart his full flight simulator program because no other trainee remained in his class. Despite all of this, he eventually passed and was assigned to the line. The NTSB later called his training record, in a single word, terrible. On February 23, 2019, Atlas Air Flight 3591 departed Miami, carrying cargo bound for Houston. On board were Captain Rick Blakely, First Officer Aska as pilot flying, and a third pilot riding in the jump seat on his way home. The flight was routine until the descent into Houston, when the airplane entered light turbulence and descended through clouds at about 6,000 feet. At 12:38, something small happened. Aska was holding the speed brake lever with his left hand. The go-around switches on the Boeing 767 are located on the aft side of the thrust levers, directly adjacent to the speed brake. In the turbulence, Aska's wrist or watch likely brushed one of the switches. Go-around mode activated. The engines spooled up. The airplane pitched up slightly, about 3.6 degrees. This was not dangerous. Go-around mode on the 767 is a known, manageable event. A pilot can cancel it by pressing the disconnect button or simply overriding the autopilot. But the airplane was in cloud. Aska could not see outside. And in the seconds after the engines accelerated, something happened inside his inner ear. When the human body is pushed forward by sudden acceleration and has no visual reference to confirm its actual orientation, the brain can misinterpret the sensation. It feels like the body is tilting backward. It feels like the airplane is pitching up sharply. This is called somatographic illusion, and every instrument-rated pilot is trained to recognize it. The solution is simple. Trust your instruments, not your body. The instruments will show the airplane's actual attitude. The body will lie. Aska did not trust his instruments. He believed the airplane was pitching up into a stall. He pushed the control column forward, hard. The nose dropped. The airplane entered a dive. On the cockpit voice recorder, his voice registered surprise. "Oh, whoa." The dive steepened. The airplane accelerated further. The acceleration made the illusion worse. Aska pushed harder. Captain Blakely had been programming the flight computer during the approach and did not immediately notice what was happening. By the time he looked up, the airplane was already in a steep descent. He pulled back on the control column, but Aska was still pushing forward on his side. Unlike the Airbus side-stick system, the Boeing yoke is mechanically linked. Both pilots' inputs add together. Blakely pulled, Aska pushed. The net input remained nose down. Blakely never issued a clear takeover command. He never said, "I have the controls." Without that call, neither pilot had clear authority. 32 seconds after go-around mode activated, the Boeing 767 struck Trinity Bay at high speed. All 3 people on board were killed. Security cameras at a nearby jail captured the final seconds, showing the airplane in a near-vertical dive. The NTSB investigation uncovered the full scope of Aska's concealed history. He had deliberately hidden his failures from Atlas Air and from at least one other previous employer. The FAA was supposed to have built a centralized pilot records database that would have flagged these gaps. Congress had mandated it years earlier. The FAA had not implemented it. The NTSB chairman said the first officer's deliberate concealment deprived Atlas of the ability to evaluate his fitness to fly. Atlas Air's training director said during the hearing that they would not have hired Aska if they had known his full record. One board member responded simply, "I am miffed why this pilot was allowed to continue in the cockpit. Before the flight left Lima, someone washed the airplane. That is how 70 people died." The Boeing 757 had arrived at Jorge Chavez International Airport with bird strike damage. Maintenance crews replaced 2 fan blades in the right engine and cleaned the underside of the fuselage. To protect sensitive instruments from polish and water during the cleaning, a maintenance worker covered the aircraft's static ports with tape. Static ports are small openings on the fuselage that measure air pressure. Together with the pitot tubes, they feed data to the flight computers that calculate airspeed, altitude, and vertical speed. Without them, the airplane is essentially flying without a speedometer or altimeter. The tape was supposed to be removed after cleaning. It was not. The worker used ordinary duct tape instead of the bright, high-visibility covers with "remove before flight" flags that are standard in the industry. The Boeing 757 did not come with dedicated static port covers. The tape was nearly invisible against the fuselage, especially at night, and the ports were high enough above the ground that a walk-around inspection would not easily catch them. The captain, a 58-year-old veteran with 22,000 flight hours, did not notice them during his pre-flight check. At 42 minutes past midnight on October 2, 1996, Flight 603 took off from Lima, bound for Santiago, Chile, with 61 passengers and 9 crew. The flight lifted off normally. Then within seconds, every basic instrument in the cockpit began behaving in ways the crew had never seen. The airspeed indicators were wrong. The altimeters were wrong. The vertical speed indicator was wrong. But they were not simply blank or frozen. They were actively displaying numbers that made no sense. The airplane's computers tried to interpret the blocked static port data and produced contradictory warnings. The rudder ratio alarm went off, a warning related to abnormal speed readings. The Mach trim alarm sounded. The overspeed warning activated, telling the pilots they were going too fast. At the same time, the underspeed warning activated, telling them they were going too slow. Both could not be true. Neither was real. The captain's reaction was immediate and accurate. He said, on the cockpit voice recorder, "Everything is fictitious. All the pitot has gone. The air data has gone." He understood that the instruments were lying. But understanding the problem and solving it were two different things. The flight was over the Pacific Ocean at night. No city lights below. No horizon. No visual reference of any kind. Without reliable instruments and without anything to see outside, the crew had no way to determine how high they were or how fast they were going. They asked air traffic control for help. The controller provided altitude and speed readings from his radar screen. The pilots assumed this information was independent. It was not. The altitude displayed on the controller's screen came from the airplane's transponder, which received its data from the same blocked static system. The controller was reading back the same wrong numbers the pilots were trying to escape from. Neither side understood this. For 25 minutes, the crew and the controller worked together, using data that was all coming from the same broken source. The crew decided to return to Lima. They turned back toward the coast and began what they believed was a controlled descent to 4,000 feet to intercept the instrument landing system. The overspeed warning continued to blare. The ground proximity warning system began calling out, "Too low, terrain, too low, terrain." The pilots dismissed it. They were over the ocean. There should be no terrain. But the warning was not lying. It was the one system on the airplane that was still working correctly, measuring actual distance to the surface with its own radar. The crew, overwhelmed by dozens of false alarms, had no way to know which warnings were real and which were not. At 1:11 in the morning, the left wingtip and the left engine struck the surface of the Pacific Ocean. The crew pulled back and managed to get the airplane briefly airborne again for about 19 seconds. But the left wing was torn, and the airplane rolled. It hit the water inverted at 250 knots. All 70 people on board were killed. The investigation found that the static ports had been covered with tape and never uncovered. The maintenance worker, Eleuterio Chacaliaza, was convicted of negligent homicide. Boeing was criticized for not providing adequate training on how to fly the airplane when all air data is unreliable, and for not equipping the 757 with bright, dedicated static port covers. After the crash, such covers became standard. A piece of tape, the width of a finger, stuck over a few small holes in the side of an airplane. Every computer on board worked perfectly. Every sensor processed its input exactly as designed. But the input was wrong from the start, and nothing downstream could fix it. 9 crashes. 9 different airplanes. 9 different crews, and one common thread. Every single time, the automation did something the pilots did not expect, and the pilots could not recover fast enough to save the airplane. A software system that Boeing removed from the flight manual pushed 2 airplanes into the ground 5 months apart. A co-pilot's wrist brushed a button, and 32 seconds later, a cargo jet was at the bottom of a bay. A maintenance worker left tape on a sensor, and an entire cockpit full of instruments lied for 25 minutes straight. An autopilot and a pilot fought each other for control of the same airplane, and the autopilot won because its control surface was 3 times larger. A radio altimeter told the auto throttle that the airplane was already on the ground when it was still 2,000 feet in the air. 2 co-pilots flew a perfectly working airplane into the Atlantic, because when the autopilot quit, they could not process what was happening fast enough to save themselves. A pilot entered 2 digits into an autopilot that read them as 4, and there was no warning system installed to tell him the mountain was coming. And a training captain with 10,000 hours in his logbook watched his airplane slow to a stall on a clear day, because neither he nor anyone else in the cockpit noticed the auto throttle had stopped working. These are not stories about bad pilots. Most of these crews were experienced, qualified, and doing their jobs the way they were trained. The problem is that the training assumed they would always understand what the computer was doing. And the computers were designed by people who assumed the pilots would always be paying attention. Both assumptions were wrong. Modern commercial aviation is the safest form of transportation ever created. That is not an opinion. It is a statistical fact. And automation is one of the biggest reasons why. Autopilot systems, auto throttles, fly-by-wire protections, and flight management computers have eliminated entire categories of accidents that used to kill hundreds of people every year. The machines are not the enemy. They are the reason most of us land safely every single day. But every system has a failure mode, and the failure mode of automation is not that the computer crashes. It is that the human behind it forgets how to fly without it. Every generation of technology makes the airplane safer and the pilot less necessary, until the moment the technology fails, and the pilot becomes the only thing that matters. The question is not whether we should trust automation. We should. The question is whether we are training the people behind it to survive the moments when it is not there. Because those moments are rare. They last seconds, and they are the only moments that count. The 9 crashes in this video killed over 1,000 people. Every one of those crashes was survivable if someone in the cockpit had understood what the machine was doing and why. The information was on the screens, the warnings were in the speakers, the answers were in the manuals. But understanding a machine is not the same as reading about it. It requires practice. It requires repetition. It requires flying the airplane with your hands, not just your fingers on a keyboard. The autopilot is not a pilot, it is a tool, and a tool is only as safe as the person holding it. If this video helped you understand how aviation works and why it sometimes fails, subscribe to Terra Obscura. We cover the stories that matter.